Hi everybody, Jennifer Schaus here. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us in our webinar series as we cover the FAR, or the Federal Acquisition Regulations. This is our second time covering the FAR. This year we are covering each part on Wednesdays and Fridays at 12 Eastern. All of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. You'll find all of the recordings on our YouTube channel, along with 600 to almost 700 now other government contracting videos. The PowerPoints are also complimentary. You can find them on the slideshare.net site, which you can log in using your LinkedIn credentials. We do have sponsor and advertising options available. If you're interested, you can shoot us an email. How to sign up for the series over on our website under the section called the FAR. It's as simple as that. You can navigate to any of the parts that you want to register for. Again, it's all complimentary, and the recordings are also posted here. As I mentioned, we covered the FAR back in 2020. We did the DFARs in 2021 and the FAR supplements in 2022. So if you are anxious to get to a part that we have yet to cover, just make a note that this was 4 years ago. So some of the regulations may have changed and the information may be out of date. That's why we are reviving the series this year. So just make a note of that. A little bit about us before we get started. Our services are professional consulting services for established government contractors. We help with anything from market analysis through to contract vehicles, primarily focused on GSA schedules, but other multiple award contract vehicles, NASA SUP, Seaport, and the others. We also do offer contract administration services. The best email address to reach us is listed there at the bottom of the screen at the hello@jenniferschaus.com. In the event that you're selling to federal contractors, we've got advertising options available in our newsletter, webinar, as well as social media. We've got an event coming up in June at the Kennedy Center. Stay tuned for the exact date and registration link. And if you want more information on any of these opportunities, shoot us an email and ask for our media kit. On that note, we do have a special that's running now. Our newsletter now reaches over 30,000 subscribers, most of which are government contractors. And we've got as you can see here, the buy one, get one digital advertising offer. Again, shoot us an email if you would like to participate in placing an ad. Here's the contract vehicles that I mentioned that we can help with currently, Navy Seaport and NASA SUP, as well as the GSA multiple award schedule. Of note, some hearings that are happening up on Capitol Hill in the event that you're selling to any of these departments or agencies. These are open to the public, so keep those in mind. These are scheduled out until May 2nd, and then some happening later this afternoon. So after the webinar, if you hop over to Capitol Hill, for those that are local, you can catch perhaps 2 of these hearings that may be helpful to you in just understanding the budget for these, again, departments or agencies that you're selling to. Sponsored content webinars, these aren't happening until June, but they're filling up fast. Carrie Palmatier is going to cover a 2-part series on SBIRs and STTRs. I think these will be great and fun webinars, and just interesting and worth participating in. These will also be recorded, so if you're not able to attend the live session on Thursday, June 20th or the 27th, the recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as on our website, and Carrie will probably send that out to anybody that registers as well. These registration links are found on our website under the section called Events. Even though these are webinars, they are listed under events, but there's nothing to physically attend. It's just a webinar. Okay, now we want to thank our webinar sponsors. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to the longtime and generous corporate sponsors, and please allow me to introduce those. So first, we want to thank our friends over at GovEvents. That's the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert. That's the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars in their calendar. The Virginia PTAC, which is now called the Virginia Apex Accelerator, is over at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and offers free one-on-one counseling to establish government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is, however, limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they are received and based on counselor availability due to very high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. The Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce has a monthly government contracting council meeting, allowing you to network with contracting peers, learn about upcoming events, opportunities, and also contribute to future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on Tuesday, April 23rd, which I believe is actually next week. Please also join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. This is their 12th annual B2G Matchmaking Conference and Expo. It's Thursday, May 2nd. I think it's a Thursday, from 8 to 1 over in Reston at the Sheraton. We will be there and have a booth, and we hope to see you there, so please stop by. BidSpeed. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find bidding opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrix, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. And BidSpeed is an official partner of the US SBA 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program, which has been renamed the Empower to Grow program. The Federal Business Council, they have an event coming up soon over at the Convention Center. It's their annual matchmaking event or conference, B2G conference. But events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. FBC has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, tech expos, and off-site meetings. FBC provides full life cycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at fbcinc.com. Okay, I need a drum roll here. Last but not least, we want to thank our friends at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read government contracting newsletter, keeping thousands of government contracting professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. And we encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, and those are our sponsors. Today, the reason that we're here is to talk about the FAR, specifically FAR Part 25. Kara Wolf from McCarter and English has joined us, and she's put together a great slide deck. She's got some solid information to share with you. I'm going to put myself on mute and turn the floor over to Kara. Kara, thanks again for joining us. Let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Great. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about one of my favorite parts of the FAR, and I mean that seriously, FAR Part 25. This is the part of the FAR that essentially walks us through the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreements Act requirements and how those are implemented by contracting officers in performance of government contracts. But before we get into that, a little bit about me. As Jennifer said, I'm Kara Wolf. I'm a partner at McCarter and English. We're a full service law firm dealing with just everything that, everything that a company might encounter, right? And my practice focuses entirely on government contracting. So really everything from pre-bid or bid protest type of experiences, all the way through contract administration and claims and appeals. We handle it all. I do have a lot of experience dealing with these regulations with FAR Part 25 and the Buy American trade agreements requirements specifically. So looking forward to sharing that information with you today. Next slide, please. All right, so starting at the very top, FAR 25.1 is really where you're going to find the set of regulations implementing the Buy American Act, 41 U.S.C. Chapter 83. FAR subpart 25.1 is going to deal with the Buy American requirements as they relate to the acquisition of supplies. 25.2, which we'll get to in a moment, will deal with the application of the Buy American requirements as they relate to construction. And the basic policy as expressed here in FAR 25.102 is that except as provided in 25.103, so that's the exceptions we'll cover in a second, the contracting officer is to acquire only domestic end products for public use inside the United States. And that's a pretty small sentence, but it's loaded with meaning. What is a domestic end product? What is public use inside the United States? All things that are addressed here. So the application here is going to be, again, supplies acquired for use in the United States, including supplies acquired under contracts set aside for small business concern. So if you're a small business concern, this will apply to you. The supply contract needs to exceed the micro purchase threshold, or the supply portion of the contract that for services that involves the furnishing of supplies exceeds the micro purchase threshold. So that means that these domestic preference requirements are going to apply to pretty much, all acquisitions by the government over that threshold of $10,000. Next slide, please. So what constitutes a domestic end product for purposes of, supplying something that complies with the FAR Part 25 requirements? Well, there's a two-part test that we commonly talk about when we're talking about BAA compliance. And is the product or material manufactured in the US, and does a certain percentage of the cost of domestic components, or does the cost of the domestic components exceed a certain percentage of the cost of all of the components in the product? The mechanisms for that are set out here in FAR 25.101. There are different component tests for items that consist wholly or predominantly of iron or steel, or a combination of both, and items that do not. Kind of skipping to the bottom of the slide here, but for those end products that consist wholly or predominantly of iron or steel, or a combination of both, the threshold is 95%, right? The cost of foreign iron and steel has to constitute less than 5% of the cost of all of the components used in the end product. And for end products that do not consist wholly and predominantly of iron and steel, the threshold percentage is going to be 65%. Now, that is a threshold that is currently in place. There is an escalation built in to the FAR here that's going to escalate to 75% as of calendar year 2029. So over the past couple of years, we've seen revisions to these regulations to kind of increase the amount of domestic content required to comply with these requirements. If you're supplying a COTS item, a non-iron or steel COTS item, that component test is going to be waived, but it has not been waived for acquisition of COTS items that are wholly or predominantly of iron or steel, except for COTS fasteners. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are exceptions to this requirement that are outlined here in 25.103. First is the public interest exception, which is essentially where the head of the agency can make a determination that applying the domestic preference requirements would be inconsistent with the public interest. The most common way that we see this exception used is through the implementation of the Trade Agreements Act, which we'll talk about when we get to FAR 25.4 in more detail. But essentially, that is where the U.S. is party to a number of trade agreements where the nations that are signatories to those agreements agree to remove discriminatory requirements for products or services from other signatories. So what that means, in practical terms, is if we have a trade agreement with the government, we have a variety of trade agreements. Let's just use the WTO GPA as an example. We're party to that, and France is party to that. because of the operation of that agreement, our companies are given access to, French government procurements, and in exchange, we give access to our government procurements to French companies, right? So the public interest angle there is that it's promoting U.S. companies and giving them the ability to compete for those types of acquisitions. So that's how that's implemented. There are, one-off cases of public interest exceptions. Those are, frankly difficult, but there are. Those are available in certain circumstances where it is, that the domestic preference would be inconsistent with public interest, but that's going to be a more fact-specific question. Next slide, please. Non-availability is another commonly used exception. So this is this waives the application of the Buy American Act for situations where supplies, articles, or materials of the class or kind to be acquired are not mined, produced, or manufactured in the U.S. in sufficient and reasonably available commercial quantities and of satisfactory quality. So, the objective here of these domestic preference regulations as implemented through, FAR 25 is to increase the amount of domestic end products in the government supply chain. The reality of the situation is, in a lot of cases, there aren't products available in the United States to meet those requirements. So there is this exception available. FAR 25-104 has a set of items that are listed there that have been deemed not available. This class determination you'll find there, and then so there won't be a need for an individual determination for those items that are already listed, but agencies can make individual determinations of non-availability as well. Next slide, please. The unreasonable cost exception, that will apply where the contracting officer determines that the cost of a domestic end product is going to be unreasonable. So I always like to think of this as sort of a balancing of priorities here. The government, again, wants to acquire, increase the amount of domestic end products we have in the supply chain. At the same time, there's a consideration of being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. So if the cost to acquire those domestic end products is unreasonable, then an exception to the Buy American Act would be appropriate in that circumstance. Next slide, please. The way that reasonableness kind of plays out is, that when that determination is made is through the evaluation process. What essentially happens here, and this is set out in FAR 25-106 in determining reasonableness of cost, well, the contracting officer will basically take, if there's a domestic offer that's not the low offer and the low offer is a foreign offer, okay, so the foreign offer is lower, there is a foreign offer that is lower than a domestic offer, then we have to determine, is that price differential reasonable, right? Are we, the taxpayer, the U.S. government, are willing to pay a little bit more to have that domestic end product in the acquisition, but only up to a point. And that point is 20% if the lowest domestic offer is from a large business, or 30% if the lowest domestic offer is from a small business. So again, balancing the priorities there, willing to pay a little bit, even a little bit more, to make sure that the small businesses are given the opportunity to enter into these agreements. And the evaluation will basically determine, if the price of the domestic offer is reasonable, if it doesn't exceed the evaluated price of the low offer after you add that evaluation factor. So if that price advantage from the foreign offer is eliminated after the application of the price evaluation factor, then the price would not be unreasonable. Next slide, please. So FAR 25.2, so that is going to be the construction materials sort of parallel to FAR 25.1. It's going to, it's covering, it's again implementing, the Buy American Act and any of the executive orders that have sort of expanded or clarified the operation of that law. This is going to apply specifically to contracts for construction, alteration, or repair of any public building or public work in the U.S. Next slide, please. So again, the policy here is going to be to use only domestic construction materials and construction contracts performed in the U.S. And a construction material is going to be defined here as an article, material, or supply brought to the construction site by a contractor or subcontractor for incorporation into the building or work. And that's an important thing to pay attention to here, that it's encompassing materials that are brought to a site by a subcontractor, right? So, you know, whether you're in a situation of a prime contractor or if you're a subcontractor, you're likely to, in a construction context, you're likely to see these requirements kind of applicable down the chain if you're bringing that construction material to the site. I haven't put it on the slide here, but the definition of a domestic construction material is very similar to the definition of a domestic end product that we talked about in the context of 25.1. That's going to be, you know, that two-part test again. Is it manufactured in the United States, and does that, you know, does a certain percentage of the cost of the components needs to be domestic, right? And that's going to be that's going to vary depending on whether the material, the construction material, is wholly or predominantly iron or steel or a combination of both, or whether it isn't. Next slide, please. Similar exceptions, again, in the 25.2 application of Buy American requirements to construction contracts, you have the same type of exceptions that we just talked through: the impracticable or inconsistent with public interest, non-availability, unreasonable cost. Information technology that's a commercial product. I didn't talk about this in the context of 25.1, but there are this and items that are acquired for commissary resale or other smaller exceptions to the BAA that are going to be in here. I guess the core takeaway here is to identify, you know, when you're looking at a procurement and you're thinking, okay, I'm dealing with this Buy American requirement, you know, is it appropriately in the contract? The key here is going to be to go back and look at the FAR Part 25 regulations and identify, you know, what exceptions are available and whether one of them should apply. In the construction context, they break out the public interest exception and the trade, you know, acquisitions after trade agreements. So they have those kind of, they operate the same way, but they're separated out for purposes of this particular section of the regulation. But that's where you're going to find kind of the meat and potatoes of what the government requires with regard to supply of domestic construction materials on construction contracts subject to the Buy American Act. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to pivot a little bit. Just take us out of Buy American land here for a second. So again, FAR Part 25 is dealing with sort of the involvement of foreign, you know, foreign acquisition in the U.S. government supply chain. As part of that is, you know, if contractors are going to be, you know, performing outside the United States, perhaps in places where they need logistical and security support for their employees, FAR 25.3 clarifies that, you know, generally speaking, contractors are going to be responsible providing their own logistical and security support in those situations. You know, there are certain situations where the agency may provide that support, which are set forth here, and you know that's going to be, you know, contracting officers instructed to clarify that in the contract document, the extent in the solicitation, the extent of the support to be provided, and whether that's going to be reimbursable, and what authority there is to reimburse that support. Next slide, please. So again, you know, this is going to sort of walk through the policy here that is going to apply in these types of situations. Again, this is going to be applicable to contractors that are performing outside the United States. If they're performing private security functions, right, they're going to have specific responsibilities that are going to be set forth here as well, including, you know, whether the contractor's keeping appropriate personnel records, accounting for weapons, registering, identifying armored vehicles, helicopters, and military vehicles, reporting incidents, etc. So this references, you know, any requirement to cooperate with government authorized investigations in any sort of incidents, and sets forth the implementing guidance. It's very specifically tailored for these types of situations. If you're not in this type of a acquisition, you're not likely to see this. You might see the 52, 225, 26 contractors performing private security functions outside the United States slipped into some of your contracts. But if you're not performing those private security functions outside the United States, you may not have occasion to grapple with this, but if you are, this is where you'll find kind of the core requirements in the policy that will apply. Next slide, please. All right, ducking back into the Buy American and Buy American adjacent requirements, FAR subpart 25.4 is going to provide us with the policies and procedures that implement the trade agreements, right? I talked about the WTO GPA. We have various free trade agreements with some countries, least developed country designations, Caribbean Basin Trade Initiative, Israeli Trade Act, Agreement on Trade and Civil Aircraft. 25.4 is the subpart here that's going to explain how those how those acquisitions that are covered by those situations are going to be addressed. Next slide, please. So at its core, and set forth in 25.402, what the Trade Agreements Act essentially does is it gives the president authority to waive the Buy American statute and other discriminatory provisions for eligible products from countries that have signed an international trade agreement with the United States or meet these other specified criteria. So again, this is essentially going to give eligible products from those signatories or those other countries equal consideration with domestic offers. To the extent that we're talking about services, the Trade Agreements Act applying to services, the country of origin of services is going to be the country in which the firm providing the services is established. Next slide, please. So what are the designated, non-designated, okay, so the designated countries are going to be listed in FAR 25.4. I haven't put them all up here because the font would be impossibly tiny, but you'll find, you'll find listed in 25.4 those designated countries. And what you'll see when you find, you find yourself confronted with the actual Trade Agreements Act clauses in FAR Part 52, you'll find that you're able to supply end products or construction materials from designated countries. That term is going to encompass all those signatories. You're going to find a lot of different countries, a lot of different signatories, European countries, Asian countries, African countries, all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But when you look at, and that list will be updated periodically, so you want to make sure that your version of the Trade Agreements Act clause, that you're aware of what set of designated countries you're dealing with, because it can vary as countries enter and leave these trade agreements. But I think the more interesting list maybe to consider here is what's not on that designated country list. And some of those non-designated countries are going to be China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. You can add Russia to this. A variety of countries that are pretty significant manufacturers, but that are not considered designated countries, and so you won't be permitted under the Trade Agreements Act clauses and requirements to provide products and construction materials from those countries, except unless one of the exceptions applies. Next slide, please. So the trade agreements are going to kick in at a certain, generally speaking, are going to kick in at a certain dollar threshold. For supplies and services, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $170,000, $180,000 is usually where you'll find the Trade Agreements Act come into effect for those supply contracts. For construction contracts, the dollar threshold is much higher. You're going to find a $6.7 million, $6.708,000 is going to be the threshold at which the trade agreements requirements are going to kick in for construction contracts. I'm generalizing here. There are exceptions, which we'll talk about a little bit here in a moment, but the ultimate requirement is going to be if it exceeds that dollar threshold, the Trade Agreements Act requirements rather than the Buy American Act requirements are going to apply. Next slide, please. These are the exceptions that I mentioned. So remember that the Trade Agreements Act is implemented through an exception to the Buy American Act. So if you have an exception to the exception, which is what we're talking about here, you're going to be back in FAR Part 25.1 or FAR Part 25.2, dealing with the Buy American requirements. So the exceptions here are going to be acquisitions set aside for small businesses is one I see a lot. Sole source acquisitions or acquisitions not using full and open competition. And then other, goods and services specifically excluded under individual trade agreements. As I said, for the most part, this dollar threshold is going to dictate whether we're dealing with the trade agreements or the Buy American Act. But there are, certain items and certain services that are specifically excluded from those trade agreements. Next slide. All right. So when confronted with the several offers where the contracting officer has to kind of wrestle with, okay, I've got offers from non-domestic sources. Subpart 25.5 is going to give the contracting officer basically the instruction manual of how to evaluate those foreign offers, right? They're going to be required to apply the evaluation procedures to each line item unless it specifies evaluation on a group basis. So the procedures are going to be set out here. It specifies here that the contracting officer can rely on the offer certification of end product origin when they're evaluating for an offer, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the clauses that are dictated in subpart 2511. And basically just instructs the contracting officer, you have to reject offers of end products that are prohibited in accordance with 25.7, and clarifies for them that when we're dealing with the trade agreements, you're not going to use the Buy American evaluation factors to provide a preference for one foreign offer over another foreign offer. The unreasonable cost evaluation factors are not going to apply in the TAA context. And so 25.5 will walk the contracting officer through what is required of them. Now I'm talking about this in terms of what the contracting officers is able to do with this reference, but it's also very useful for contractors who are perhaps disappointed bidders on a particular acquisition. They'll want to familiarize themselves with these evaluation procedures, because if there's a basis to challenge the government's award decision on the basis that it didn't follow the appropriate evaluation procedures, this is the first place you'd want to look to determine what those are and what the misstep may have been. Next slide, please. All right, so this section, this subpart here, I don't see it come into play very much anymore. This is related to the specific domestic preference requirement that was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I believe that's from 2009, and for them, I still see it pop up every now and again. But for the most part, those funds have sort of been used, and I don't see a lot of acquisitions these days that are specifically dealing with ARA, and specifically the ARA Buy American requirement. But it is still here. It is still part of our Part 25 in the event that you are part of an acquisition that's dealing with these specific domestic source requirements. So it's a slightly different, it's a slightly different domestic preference requirement here, requiring, it's similar to what we've already talked about, but it basically says all of the steel, iron, and manufactured goods used as construction material in a project have to be produced or manufactured in the United States. And if the trade agreements are applying to that specific acquisition, the manufactured construction material either has to comply with these requirements or be wholly the product of or substantially transformed in a Recovery Act designated country. So again, similar kind of procedures to the Buy American Trade Agreements Act requirements that we see in other acquisitions, but it is specific to what the Recovery Act required at the time. But again, I don't see this coming into play that often anymore. Next slide, please. Again, there are going to be some exceptions. Again, when you start talking about domestic preference requirements and these obligations, you start to see some of the same vocabulary instead of the same themes that arise again and again and again. And this is no exception. This is no exception when we're talking about exceptions, right? There are potential exceptions to the Recovery Act specific Buy American requirement, specifically non-availability, unreasonable cost, and inconsistent with the public interest, which we've already talked about in the context of those Buy American trade agreements requirements already. There's also an opportunity here for the head of the agency to determine that application of the Buy American statute to a particular unmanufactured construction material be impracticable. So again, in the event you are in a situation where you're dealing with an award that's been funded by ARA funds, and you're facing this difficulty, this is something to be aware of and familiar with. Next slide, please. Again, this is how the ARA requirements deal with the application of trade agreements. Again, you're going to see the threshold requirements apply here as well. And then, there's an exclusion here from the category of designated countries for Caribbean basin countries. So I guess the key takeaway here is really if you're dealing with these 25.6 ARA funded contracts, you want to make sure that you're familiar with some of the nuances of the domestic reference requirements under that statute, and this is where you're going to find them. Next slide, please. Okay. So FAR subpart 25.7 deals with certain prohibited sources, specific sources. This isn't really specific to the Buy American Act, the Trade Agreements Act, or ARA, or anything like that. But it's kind of a blanket requirement that agencies and contractors and subcontractors can't acquire anything, from any source that is prohibited under, OFAC's implementing regulations, entering executive orders, et cetera. This is kind of a broad category of authorizations here. But what it boils down to is essentially that most transactions involving Cuba, Iran, and Sudan are prohibited, as are most imports from Burma or North Korea into the U.S. or its outlying areas. So, important to you'll see, and we'll talk about in the clauses that apply here, where you'll see this come into play. It is going to be required of subcontractors as well, so a flow down requirement. In addition, there are particular lists of entities and individuals that are specifically subject to economic sanctions. There's going to be on an OFAC list of specially designated nationals and blocked persons. So you will want to double check the OFAC websites to identify any potential prohibited sources and to ensure that they're not being included in whatever is being delivered to the government under a given procurement. Next slide, please. All right, so there's another subpart here that's dealing with other international agreements. So this is something that will come into play if the performance is taking place outside of the United States. And the instruction here is just for the contracting officer to determine the existence and applicability of these international agreements, ensure compliance with the agreements, make sure that any necessary acquisition planning and coordination is being accomplished here. And make sure that everything that's being awarded to Taiwanese firms is going through the American Institute of Taiwan, which is under contract to the Department of State. Next slide, please. All right, so customs and duties is going to be another pretty specific set of requirements here. To the extent that you're importing foreign supplies into the United States, there are potentially exemptions here when anticipated savings to appropriated funds outweigh the administrative costs associated with processing required documentation. So to the extent you're going to be dealing with importation and duties, the customs regulations are going to be the source of guidance for this. Next slide. All right, again, this is sort of a catch-all part here, FAR Part 25, and we're dealing with anything non-domestic, and this subpart 25.10 deals with the use of foreign currency and how contracting officers should be grappling with that. Contracting officers essentially have to, unless there's some requirement of a specific currency, contracting officers have to determine if solicitations for contracts to be entered into and performed outside the U.S. require submission of offers in U.S. currency or specified foreign currency. Theoretically, in some circumstances, the contracting officer could permit submission of offers in other than a specified currency. But generally, solicitation should require all the offers to be priced in the same currency. Next slide, please. All right. So the final subpart here, 25.11, sets out the solicitation provisions and contract clauses, basically implementing all of the regulatory requirements that we just ran through here. When we're talking about the Buy American requirements applicable to supplies, you're generally going to see 52225-1 in those contracts, right? And that's essentially going to implement the requirements of subpart 25.1 and dictate that the contractor shall supply only domestic end products, except for those end products that's disclosed in its Buy American certificate, which is 52225-2. And it's supposed to be included in solicitations that are going to be subject to 52225-1. That's where you're going to find, where you're going to have the opportunity to basically tell the government, here are the foreign end products that I'm going to be proposing, and the requirements there are, and so then the government can basically determine at the time of evaluation of offers whether one of its exceptions should apply, right? The unreasonable cost being kind of the most immediate one. If you're going to be proposing a foreign end product, and the government can then apply that price factor to it and determine whether it's going to use those accept those foreign end products on the basis of that exception or not. Or the government can take the opportunity to determine whether something's not available, or it should be subject to the public interest exception, or so on. Next slide, please. So we'll get into, once we get past a certain dollar threshold, and again, it gets a little complex in terms of like which dollar thresholds kick in where, but at the level of somewhere between 50,000 and 174,000, certain trade agreements kick in, but not all of them. So in that situation, you're going to be dealing with 52225-3, which is going to have specific application to the Israeli Trade Act, and then the provision at 52225-4 is going to have a certificate that's going to require application of those procedures as well. Next slide, please. The General Trade Agreements Act clause, which is usually going to be what kicks in the current, like I said, the current threshold for Trade Agreements Act countries that are Trade Agreements Act acquisitions that are for supplies is $174,000. So assuming we're above that threshold, and we usually are for supply contracts, not 100% of the time, but often. I mean, this is lower than the simplified acquisition threshold. So you do see the Trade Agreements Act clause in supply contracts fairly often that exceed that amount. The 52225-5 is going to appear when you've got a contract that's above that threshold, and the Buy American requirements aren't going to apply here. 52225-6 is the Trade Agreements Act certificate, which is where you're going to see the requirements, similar requirements to disclose any non-U.S. or designated country end products that you intend to offer to the government. You're not going to have the price differential applied to this, as we saw in FAR subpart 25.5. That's not going to give you the ability to the government the ability to kind of differentiate between foreign offers here. But there are again potentially situations where the government will need to accept something non that's not a domestic end product or designated country end product. So, but another certificate is important to fill out accurately as well. Next slide, please. All right, so these are, again, a set of clauses that you're likely to see kind of stemming from those particular subparts that we just talked about. If we're dealing with the civil aircraft and related articles, that waiver for civil aircraft and related articles is going to apply. Duty-free entry and going to be included in solicitations and contracts for supplies imported, where duty-free entry is going to be applicable here. Place of manufacture will be required in contracts, or in solicitations, predominantly for the acquisition of manufactured end products. Next slide, please. So for construction materials, it's sort of the parallel to 52225-1. You'll see 52225-9 in construction contracts that are going to be subject to the Buy American requirements. Again, the dollar threshold there is significantly higher. It's going to be $6.7 million. So you'll see that in a lot of construction, smaller construction projects that'll be subject to the Buy American Act, which will require you to supply only domestic construction material. 225-10 is essentially the solicitation notice to contractors of the Buy American requirements and gives them the opportunity to propose materials for exception to the Buy American requirements. Next slide. All right, similarly, 52225-11 and 12, those are the construction material parallels to the Trade Agreements Act clause and the Trade Agreements Act certificate for supplies. That's going to be in solicitations and contracts valued at $6.7 million or more. And again, 52225-12 is going to identify the situations where you may need to provide information to the government to allow them to determine whether they're going to waive that requirement or not. Next slide. All right, again, ARA, if you're dealing with Recovery Act funded projects, you're likely to see, we just talked about 9, 10, 11, and 12. You'll see 21, 22, 23, or 24 instead. That will, again, be specific. You shouldn't see those that much anymore. If you do, it might be worth asking the question whether that's the correct clause that should be in there, given that most of those funds are kind of already passed. But the requirements will be set forth in those clauses. Next slide, please. All right. So just a few more clauses that you're likely to see here, kind of covering those requirements that were in the other subparts that we talked about, that restrictions on certain foreign purchases. You'll see that's the Cuba, Iran, Sudan, Burma, North Korea restriction. That's going to be found in that clause. There are going to be other requirements here, depending on, if the contract is going to be anticipated to be translated into another language, if there is a opportunity to offer complete the offer to use other than a specified currency. The prohibition on conducting restricted business operations in Sudan, that's going to be broadly included in solicitations, except for those that are for commercial products and services, and in a similar certification for prohibition on contracting with entities engaging in certain activities or transactions relating to Iran. So you'll have, again, certifications regarding the restrictions on interactions with those particular countries. And that is I think that maybe our last slide here. Next slide. Yep, that's it. So that's hopefully been helpful. A very high level overview of what the subparts of the FAR are here. Of course, we could, as I said at the beginning, I see questions come up about these requirements all the time. This is a particular area. Buy American and domestic preference requirements are a particular area where I see a lot of increased scrutiny by the government. Certainly, it's something that's been a talking point in both this and the prior administration. So these regulations have been changing fairly rapidly, given that these have been in place for a long time. The Buy American Act's been in existence since the 1930s, but it's getting increased kind of recognition these days. And so, happy to answer any questions offline that anybody has if you've been confronted with these requirements, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you.
Kara, this was great. Thank you so much. I felt like I took a couple of notes here and learned a lot. And you're right, the information is changing at a pretty fast pace. So if anybody has questions, please contact Kara directly. You've got her email here. She's also on LinkedIn. And I think that will more or less wrap it up for us. Again, today's recording can be found on our YouTube channel. If you're watching the recording, leave a comment, like our videos, or subscribe to our channel. It won't cost you anything. You'll be alerted anytime we upload any new webinars. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks again to Kara for a great presentation. It was very thorough, complete, and had a lot of great valuable information. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and we'll see you on Friday for the next part.